It is now time to prime our brass. Now that it's prepped and ready to go, these primers are what goes bang and what ignites the smokeless powder. So just like everything else, there's a few ways to do the primer seating, and I'll show you a few different ways. What I've done is placed 10 primers in a primer flip tray with the anvil facing up. I like using these Winchester primers because they're actually color-coded. These small rifle primers have a green color inside of them, which if you find a stray or something, you can kind of know if it's rifle or pistol. So before we start priming the brass that we prepped in the previous videos, it's good to use a case gauge to check to make sure that your brass is full-length sized and it will chamber properly in your firearm. This is actually part, I would consider, of the die setup. If your dies are set up properly, this should not be an issue, but just to give you an example, we're going to take a brass cartridge that we resized in the previous video, and I'm going to drop it in, and you can see here there's a high and a low, and it's fitting right in there just where it should, nice and flush. The other side of it, it's below the line, and this end mark on the case gauge is actually the maximum length. So you can see that we are within that range, and it should drop freely out. So the cartridge should fall right in and then easily drop right out. So I'll just show you a couple of these. Drops in, it's nice and flush, it's not too long, drops right out. Like I said, this is part of the die setup in my opinion, but it's always good to double check before you start loading a lot of rounds. Okay, now we're ready to prime some cases. So what I'm going to do is show you 5 cases primed on the single stage. Priming on the single stage is simple, it's a piece of cake. You have a primer arm here, and I have this small primer cup installed on here. So we're just going to grab a primer with the green side, the anvil side facing up, and with the same shell holder that we used before, we're going to put a resized piece of brass in here. Now, one thing I did not mention in the previous video, it should be understood, but I'm gonna say it anyways. Wait for your brass to be completely dry before you put any kind of primer in it, any kind of powder charge. That should go without being said, but I wanted to make that clear in this video that this brass has fully dried. I know in the last 2 videos we exposed it to water 2 different times, once in the initial cleaning and then the second time in the wet tumbling, but this brass has completely dried. It's safe to load. You can, if you're in a hurry, place damp brass in a toaster oven. Some people use a food dehydrator. I just like to use time, let it evaporate. I'm not in a rush. I do big batches at a time, so I'll let it sit for a week or so just to make sure it's out. So with that being said, we're going to proceed forward here. I have the primer in the cup. We have the brass loaded. So all we have to do is lower the press and just kind of give it a little push. And we'll take it out, and you can see that we now have a seated primer. And since we removed the crimp on the primer pocket, this is possible. If we had not done that step, this would be a pain. So I'm just going to repeat this 5 times on the single stage, and then I'll move on to show you a different method. You kind of get the feel for the pressure. It's hard to explain unless you're sitting at the press, but you kind of get a feel for how much pressure is needed and when that primer is seated. The more you do it, the better you get at it, but this is not difficult. If you're doing a lot of brass, this can take up some time. I usually do my 223 priming, honestly, on my Dillon 550 on stage 1. I usually do that without a die in there, and I'll show you that in a different video. But just like that, we have primed 5 cartridges. You can see here, they look great. We can make sure that the primer is just below flush, and it looks great in all of them. So you can see with the single stage press, it's very easy to prime your cases. So we're going to move on next to the handheld primer and go from there. The next method of priming that I'm going to show you is using this Lee handheld primer tool. So the way this works is we're going to take the primer tray and open it up. Since we only have 5 primers, I'm just going to place them in here by hand. And we want to make sure that the anvil part of the primer is facing up. Usually you're going to use a whole box of 100 and you'll flip the box onto here, and you kind of give it a little shake, and it will make sure that these are all facing the same direction. Once they are, you can close it and click it up one to the lock position. You can see here it has an on, a lock, and an open position. So right now we're in the lock position, and we're going to place it into our hand priming tool. So you can see there's a handle, the primer tray, and we also have a cartridge specific shell holder on here. And once again, this is a shell holder number 4. Now this is different than the shell holder that we used in our presses. The shell holder that we use in the press has this little ring on the bottom of it. The shell holders for the hand priming tools do not have that. It's basically just this top part here. And they sell them in a whole set. I actually have them here. This is what it looks like. Don't remember the cost. I think it's maybe $15, $20, but this covers every cartridge that you would ever reload. So this one little box will give you every shell holder on here. So what we're gonna do now is flip it to the on position, and what that'll do is start funneling the primers down in here and ready to go. Now, the first time I used this, I had some issues with it, and if you read online, a lot of the bad reviews are saying that you get stuck primers, or it won't feed, or they'll go in crooked. I had those problems too when I first started. What helped me is you want to make sure that you keep the tool at as close to a 45-degree angle as you can. And with that, I rarely have issues with it. So what we're going to do is take an unprimed piece of brass, and we're going to do 5 of them. You can look in here to make sure we have a primer ready to go and it's not backwards. So we're going to put it in here, and all you do is just give it a squeeze until it stops. And just like the single stage press, you just kind of got to get a feel for it. But you can see we have a great seated primer right there. It looks good. So we're going to put that down and just continue on. Okay, we don't have a primer fed. There. 3. 4. And 5. So we just primed 10 cases, 5 on a single stage press, 5 with the handheld. You can't tell a difference. It both did the job. They'll both go bang. Either method you choose is totally fine. But like I said earlier, if I'm doing a large batch, more than likely I'm going to do the priming on my progressive press. It makes sense for me to do it that way. I'll make another video on the Dillon 550. But yeah, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any questions. Thank you.